Hi, my name is Kat Fishman, and this is my project-based learning presentation. On chapter 3, it talks about imagining the possibilities. So, the first section on big ideas talks about contemplating the main ideas of your curriculum, and a good way would be to create like a wiki. An example, so the book talked about like a classroom that created a wiki, um, and they were, I think it was a second grade classroom, and they were learning about the number 1000. So what they did is they made a wiki, and you would type in your name, and it just kept expanding and expanding, and it even like went past 1,000. So like that's a great idea to like incorporate a big idea through using a wiki. It also suggested thinking about real world contexts, and project based learning involves overlapping multiple disciplines. In the next section, planning for bigger and digital age skills, it talks about Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives, which there is five. And the five objectives are remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, and creating. And then it says that the last three, which are applying, analyzing, and creating, are the most relevant to project based learning. Excuse me. In the next section, digital age literacies, it talks about digital age skills, especially for like 21st century skills. So it talks about the Engage 21st Century Skills, which was formulated by a team that examined research, conducted literature reviews, explored workforce trends, and interviewed educators and other constituent groups. This model highlighted digital age literacy, inventive thinking, and effective communication, along with high productivity. It also goes on to talking about learning dispositions. So just a quote like I grabbed from this chapter was important. So this is what dispositions mean. It's important traits, attitudes, habits, and feelings be encouraged, but usually cannot teach directly, such as confidence, curiosity, resourcefulness, cooperation, motivation, persistence, and courage. So, some ways to like keep your students in mind when you're doing project-based learning is considering what sparks their curiosity or interests, creating an engaging environment, tap into their enthusiasm, and reinforce positive dispositions. For In the last section of chapter 3, it talked about essential learning with digital tools and the web. It suggested considering the functions technology can deliver in support of PBL, and the ability to connect and make ideas visible. Okay, so on to chapter 4, which talked about strategies for discovery. The first section was on reviewing projects, so it suggested that teachers be very selective about their projects and not just choose like the first one you see or the most convenient. Also, review other plans before deciding on the project you want to do as well. And then I talked about like pitfalls and how to overcome them. So just some of the pitfalls it mentioned in chapter 4 was long inactivity, short on learning outcomes, technology layered over traditional practice, trivial thematic units, overly scripted, not enough focus on formative assessment. Assessment is not or the assessment is not authentic. So it's important to like overcome these pitfalls, the authors called it, so that you can have a successful project-based learning. So for the next section, I talked about designing terrific projects and getting started on them. So it's suggested that letting students' curiosity and interest drive the learning experience rather than like it's just you just making it. It's better to have to do it based on what students are most interested in learning. So moving on to the next section, which was the best projects share important features. So it basically this section talked about like important qualities that are like relevant to having a successful project. So these are just some of the qualities I listed. So loosely designing with the possibility of taking different learning paths. So instead of just having like a plan to like just talk about one thing, like make your project flexible enough that it could be that it's appropriate for everyone, or that it can take different directions and have more discussion. Generative which causes students to construct meaning, centers on inquiry, so it allows the students to question or excuse me, for you to question them as well. Realistic and captures student interest and reaches to involve others outside of school. So the final section from chapter 4 was on where project ideas come from. I just talked about considering following different directions when looking for project ideas. In the last chapter we read, which was chapter 5, which was talked about making assessment meaningful, it talked about 2 different types of assessment, which was the summative and formative assessments. So in the first section, it talks about authentic assessments in project-based learning. It was just saying that in the beginning, it was just talking about how schools and districts are even slowly shifting to project-based learning. Students are, because of PBL, students are now exceeding rigorous academic expectations rather than just barely meeting them or not meeting them at all. So basically, the 2 assessments it talks about, formative and summative. Formative is continuously assessing your students, so kind of like what's it called? It's like checking in on them, and building on it. And then summative assessment would be evaluating the student work or assessing student learning after projects. So planning for summative assessments. So the first step in designing a project would be determining what students will learn from the project. The next step is evidence of the learning. So this is where summative assessment comes in. So how are students going to demonstrate what they've learned from the project? And then, so this is just a really important quote I grabbed from from this chapter, which said, planning is an iterative process, and it had like a graphic, and it talked about like shaping learning goals, evidence, and project activities, and how they all relate to summative assessment. And then for formative assessment, it talked about planning how to plan it. So this kind of assessment enables guiding student efforts towards learning goals. It makes it's when you make necessary alterations to help your students. And it sets milestones. So a good example it brought up was interim assignments or check-ins, like I mentioned earlier. So, for example, turning in an outline before a research paper would be an interim assignment or a milestone in this case. So rather than just setting a due date for like the next week for a research paper without receiving the feedback that students need, they're not going to do as well, or they're not going to do it at all. So it gives the teacher the opportunity to know what they expect and what the students are understanding from the project. So it said also to plan check-ins, although so it talks about how check-ins are like just brief meetings or written updates that go over the learning skills or processes during the project. And then check-ins don't need to be planned, but they're necessary if the necessity comes up. And then it allows growth for critical skills such as collaborations. So if you guys, so like a check-in would be like, if you're doing the outline for once everyone's turned in their outline for the research paper, like you could discuss each student's experience during the project so that others can learn. So discussing what one person did and what one other person did, so that other students can learn from that and incorporate those ideas onto their paper or whatever project is coming up. And then this is my references. Thank you.